The Hoima-Kaisotonya 83-kilometer road is a major artery in the Albertine sub-region, snaking through Kaboya Wildlife Reserve, navigating a steep escarpment before halting at the shores of Lake Albert. For the communities here, these slick roads have connected rural backwaters to civilization, brought services closer, and now serve as major supply routes for their produce. Brick and mortar businesses, hotels and banks continue to sprout in Hoima town, a sub-region yoked by scorched earth tactics by British colonialists. The discovery of oil and gas in commercial quantities in Bunyoro brought hope. Communities believed that it would usher in a new dawn. Government announced that the discovery would move Uganda into the lofty middle-income status by 2021. However, for the project-affected persons, this resource appears like a distant dream, a mirage shimmering in the desert. This is largely the subject of the book titled Before the First Drop, Oil Capitalists and the Wretches of Western Uganda. When compensation commenced for project-affected persons, at least 2,437 property owners and 7,118 persons were identified for cash compensation or the alternative of resettlement. In exchange, they were supposed to hand over large tracts of land measuring 29 square kilometers to investors for the construction of the oil refinery near the largest oil fields in Kaisotonya. Between 2013 and 2015, many families accepted cash payments and received millions of shillings as 13 villages were evicted. Many of those displaced, these migrant communities from the neighboring Zombo, Nebi and Arua districts came to pluck tea at Bugambe Tea Plantation and permanently settled here. They grew food, cash crops such as tobacco, and rowed their rickety canoes on Lake Albert to fish. Not only did they have a source of livelihood, others became well off in their communities. Their grandparents were buried here, and they have a sacred attachment to the land.
Burial grounds are being moved. Burial grounds cannot be monetized. Right? The problem with the capitalist order is we have forgotten people's psychologies. We have forgotten people's psychosocial stability. Everything is monetized. This is why we have a scourge of bipolar disorders we're not taken care of. We have a pandemic of mental illness. Nobody think about them.
Government envisaged that the compensation funds could offer a financial war chest to families to undertake business ventures that could morph into successful enterprises in their new settlements. But how could illiterate families without any financial literacy and entrepreneurial rigor be able to sustain these businesses? In sharp contrast, the compensation to some families has spawned ruin, misery, mental illness, destitution, and death. One of the authors of the book, Yusuf Serunkuma, says that the compensation turned peasants into overnight millionaires, and this was a recipe for disaster.
So all of a sudden, peasantry is a consciousness. It's not just a means of accessing your livelihood, but it's a consciousness. It's your interaction with the environment. These are not businessmen. These are men who live by tilling the land and engaging different small networks of trade where they sell their surplus. So the state gave them their money as if they had sold their land. And after that, they were on their own. That's the thing you do to a businessman, not to a state which will stand and wrestle for your life. So in a short while, all these monies were finished.
Many of those who were compensated acquired expensive tastes.
Sudden money fell into their homesteads. Men went on marrying sprees and rifts emerged within the old structure of their family, and then that collapsed. And when the money disappeared, the entire structure was, men were telling their children, you're going to school because you're looking for money. Money is here. they put them out of school. And after a year, there was no money, and the kids were already out of school, and they had developed lives which they can't sustain.
Nara Obimo Kadilo received a 250 million shillings windfall in 2013 as compensation for his land. A peasant farmer, he previously tilled his land to grow cassava and tobacco. He previously had 2 women, but upon compensation, married 5 others, purchased a second-hand lorry, a discotheque, and bought beer, soda, and livestock every weekend to entertain his guests. Kadilo stopped his children from going to school, arguing that he was rich. By 2017, he was broke, and most of his wives had deserted him. He resorted to tilling a piece of land to grow maize.
Alitia wagaija sisi kutoka kwa area gani, anakuja na bei kali, walinunua dongo kinya alikuwa sisi tunawezi nunua. Sasa sahi sisi tunapangisa dongo yawa kupangisa. Tena dongo ni haki, walinunua eka moja 30 million hapa. Hadi na sahi wanaisha jua kitu gani mwenye watakuja fanyikana tena namna si bado soma. Hiyo si bana jua dongo ya kununua hapa hakuna.
This story bears a similar strand across hundreds of families who received compensation in the Albertine sub-region. Amongst the most affected segment were children and women. For instance, out of 2,812 children in project-affected households, only 94 attended pre-primary school. Out of 679 children who attended primary school, only 118 made it to primary 7 and 48 proceeded to secondary school. 28 made it to senior 6, while only 13 made it to university. Many schools in the displaced areas were razed, including Bukoni Nursery and Primary School, Chapaloni Primary School, and Nyeihara Primary School. For instance, Chapaloni, which started as a community school in 1983 and constructed on 22 acres of land, had a head count of 375 pupils. In their new locations, learners spent about 2 hours and 24 minutes walking to a secondary school. Many children who were disillusioned after being resettled dropped out of school. According to the Resettlement Action Plan, it was envisaged that schools would be rehabilitated and expanded and new teachers recruited at the new settlements. It was also stipulated that the schools would have sports fields. But the construction of a school at a relocation site in Chakaboga is yet to be completed 9 years after the locals were resettled. As the new schools were not ready for occupation at the time of relocation, many of the children were absorbed into Kabale Public School, resulting into overcrowding.
From the time the refinery came into existence, some parents migrated from those areas to the areas of Kabale, and therefore they came with their children. Children who were studying from Nyahaira, Japalon, came and joined this school.
Some of the girls who dropped out of school got married at a tender age. Doreen Kobsinje, a development studies scholar, was amongst the researchers. She reveals that amongst the most affected were women who were discriminated. Most of those who received compensation were men because they were perceived as the owners of the land.
Now, when there are all these oil-related developments, they tend to take away this land from families, from women, and women bear the brunt. Reason, the woman will no longer have access to this land to fend for the home, but also the compensations that we had done during, when the land was being taken, they mainly went to men because men are the owners of the land. It is their names that appeared on these compensation forms. So when the money came in, it went to the bank accounts of the men. Now, what does this mean? That you have taken away this land from the woman who was the secondary user who enjoyed secondary rights to this land, and the money that is supposed to give her another life is being utilized by men only. Then the situation is really bad. I can give a scenario. Women talk to me that after men receiving these compensations, then they went on to marry second wives. They abandoned their old wives and the children, and they moved on.
Many families disintegrated as men married second wives.
So my wife said, no, you can't stay here alone. Brought me the second woman, the second wife. So I have two. It was not forcing, she did it herself. And right now we are together. They stay like sisters. They have no problem.
Opia mwendeze nyo nyamuletera nyamugamba kalibora bo mwendeze mukali kamulete ti kwenda okoleki ogende chaita akiri tube babiri ogende kuno ogenda kuno.
Told me that when the men received the money, alcohol consumption increased, and then an easy provocation to this man that had oil money in his pocket could easily call for beatings. Women were battered. And then when you look, when you see how the men spent this money, for example, stories were shared, men could go to drinking places and order for drinks for everyone, pour some beer on the ground, even give some to the dogs. And the women were like, if this money had come into their hands, then they would do so much with it.
The lesson that we got from a local council chairperson in the village, I think Ramtonga, who told us this money would have been given to us in bets. But you see, it's cheap to just compensate and walk away. It's cheap. Fairly compensate and walk away is cheap than being in the lives of these people, being the paternalistic state and being in the lives of these people, because you're transforming their lives. You need to be in their lives not just for a month or two, but for a longer period.
Women were banished and bore the brunt as they lost their source of livelihood. Many of them are nostalgic of the good old days where they had a source of livelihood. This pent-up frustration has reached a pinnacle as thousands of project-affected persons are now destitute, moving from one place to another in search of a livelihood.
One of the respondents, a senior person actually said, you know, sometimes we wish this oil was discovered elsewhere and not here.
Okuzora gwa mafuta gali mazima gulimukie.
Many of the project-affected communities expected that this black gold could transform their lives and create a new age of wealth and prosperity. But this remains an elusive dream.